Hi, folks. This is Dr. General Reverend Layman Pascal out front, so you don't have to be. Uh, I'm here on the integral stage dealing with the accusations that our official mascot, Jedediah the non-dual mule, is actually just three peculiar Slovenian immigrants in a donkey costume. But before we get to that, let's do a follow-up discussion with Lisa Maroski about the themes in her book, Embracing Paradox, Evolving Language, Expressing the Unity and Complexity of Integral Consciousness. In part one of our discussion, Lisa and I talked about a lot of the language related questions that opened up for me while reading her admirable text. And today we'll go a little further in feeling out the connection points between her thinking around the relationship of language development, world thriving, and transcendental conditions. And my own thinking around the intertwining of language, interpretation, post-metaphysical spirituality, evolutionary complexity, and postmodern philosophical ontologies. In honor of our shared interest in maybe hyperlinguistic structures and functions, you may have noticed I'm being more than usually meta-playful in the architecture of my opening introduction here. So before you can say Darmak and Gelada Tanagra, this very sentence will be over and I will have officially introduced her. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Layman. This is the second time you've mentioned Jedediah the non-dual mule, and I want to meet Jedediah.
He's temperamental, but it's worth getting to know him.
So what have
Yeah.
you cooked up for us today?
Okay, this is kind of a silly question, but I want to say something like this. In chapter 21 of your book, which is entitled Why, you write that question how Locke opens self-liberal pepper questions for thinking about or doing about flying. What did you mean by that?
I said, what?
So that's a garbled version of a sentence that's in that opening chapter. And I use it as a kind of meta question that embodies my actual query, which is about how blurring and precision operate together in evolving language structures. So I don't know how into the band Radiohead you are, but I used to say that every Radiohead album sounded like the previous album heard from another room. Like it just kind of got the rough contours. And there seems to be a way in which innovation in linguistics can operate by opening up interpretive possibilities that are locked down in very precise phrasing by remixing and blurring and sort of just getting the general contours of speech. If I mumble or remix or just sort of give fragmentary parts of something, it maybe allows the other person's intuition to combine with the rough structure of what I'm talking about to produce a predictive guess that says something more or different than the original work. And I'm curious about how you might think about something like that as one of the mechanisms of the evolution of language toward more subtle and complex patterns. That when we half get a linguistic message, we can sort of fill it in with things, and the things we fill it in with are part of our like leading edge subliminal sense of what things are. And maybe language moves forward by alternating between precision and fuzziness.
I think you've just described poetry. um, the poets actually are some of the leading edge innovators of language. Because they do stretch it and play with it and make it do things that it wasn't that words weren't intended to do. Dylan Thomas comes to mind. He combines just all kinds of playful poetic contortions of language. He uses he uses words in ways that they aren't intended to be used, thereby making you think like, okay, so he used, let's say heron in a way that doesn't fit in the syntax of this poetic line. So what does he really mean? Oh, well, herons stand there for hours on end. He's referring to patience. Or he might say heroning, like something was heroning. I'm not actually quoting anything from Dylan Thomas at the moment, but just recalling how he stretches the boundaries of what makes sense. And, you know, that's what poets are known. I mean, like, that's their expertise. The rest of us, like, use words within, we stay within the lines. They go outside the lines and create, wild, wacky, wordy wisdom. There's an alliteration for you. But to your point though, and to bring in Jean Gebser, he points out that I forget which of the poets he goes into. It wasn't Plutarch. Anyhow, that's where he first saw the integral consciousness coming into existence, was in the poetry, and how the language was changing. That's where he first started noticing the language changing toward the integral stage. To name your podcast.
Shameless plug. Yeah. What comes up for me when I think about poets like Dylan Thomas is we sort of think of them in two ways. On one hand, we think of them as language technicians working away on their poetry and revising its structure, but also as kind of mystical figures who channel this speech as if from another part of themselves or another part of reality. And that brings up the question of who is the author, right? And that's a question that was compounded and problematized in the mid 20th century by deconstructionist work and Derrida's studies and things like that. And it may be that at different developmental stages or for different ways of relating to reality, we have different assumptions about the relationship of speech to the creator of speech or the author of speech. I'm curious, when you think about um, the possibility of us collectively moving language forward and moving ourselves forward by doing so, what's the conception of the source of language, the conception of the speaker or the author that you think goes with a next phase of human languaging?
Well, as a good Jungian myself, I'd say the collective unconscious. I'm only being half facetious there, because I really do think that things come to us from the divine, and that is in fact where our creativity lies. That LLMs, large language models, Chat GPT and all of its cousins, they don't have that capacity. We do. And whether the divine is coming through you, in the form of music, like Bach. I think some of Bach's stuff is just really divinely inspired. Or whether it's coming through words, or whether it's coming through painting. I mean, Picasso was another one who I think was was working with that energy coming in and trying to paint the integral. Say, what was there more to that question?
I mean, it's sort of like, if we imagine something like the proto-integral pluralist stage,
Okay.
um, if we imagine such a thing exists, there's a lot of discussion there about the death of the author, right? And the sort of
Yeah.
undermining and the plurality of potential valid things. We no longer ask ourselves who wrote this and what did they mean, right? So there's a shift in how we think about language relative to its source. And if we go beyond that to a deeper, richer kind of integral aperspectival development, what is the relationship we imagine between language and the source of language?
Wow. So you just made me think of another question, which I haven't yet thought of yet, which is what what if it's the divine or source that's actually wanting us to um, further develop language to get us out of this kind of 17th 18th century mechanistic rationalistic rut we've gotten ourselves into. I mean, what if this impetus is actually like not coming from me? I'm just the messenger. I'm just the mouthpiece that is speaking this into existence. Um, that that means I'm not an authority, like and don't listen to me as if, I've got the answers, because each of us, I think, and this is the thing about language though that's different from like painting or composing music. Um Basically, in order for it to be useful, we all have to agree on some certain like fundamental um premises. And so as this source wants to bring new language into existence, it can't just be through a single individual. Um, it has to come really from the collective. It has to be a kind of grassroots operation. And uh, that's well, I'm not gonna say it's more difficult, but uh, it has its challenges that are different from those of just being, a single inspired individual sitting at a piano, working out the tune. Because we have to come to agree on what means what. Um, and that's going to require a lot of, shall we say, negotiation?
Two things come up for me around the idea that of the divine as the agent of speech. One is I got a flash of a memory of a period of my life where I would do automatic writing every day to try to make sure I could shift modes of my consciousness. And sometimes after several pages, this other voice would come through and like this all caps first person like voice of God thing would show up. And I was always curious whether it's outside of me or it's a function of me that got activated or whether it was like a buildup of momentum that started to speak from my previous exercise. So that's on one side. The other thing I thought of was, in some ways, of course, the Bible, right? Which is put together by humans who then sort of decide that it was the divine speaking through them. And very famously, they include the Gospel of John, where uh, God and the Word are together and the same thing. So when we're imagining maybe it's the divine speaking through us, is that another way of saying maybe we're hearing language talking to us through the other rather than hearing the other languaging something to us?
Absolutely. In Thunder Perfect Mind, the speaker at one point says, "I am the utterance of my name." And so I just had a flash of like when you and I or anybody is speaking, that vibration is is creating us, this situation right now. Um, our thoughts. I mean, vibrations don't just, I mean, we're made of water, and water is very sensitive to vibrations. And so as we speak, or as the divine is speaking through us, or as we collapse those into a non-dual situation, creation is creating itself. It's the only way I have to say it. And we get to come along for the ride.
Okay, then. Here's another example of creation creating itself and language languaging itself is um, all right, here's the backstory. I don't know if we touched on this last time or not. Anyway, in about 2015, there was this really interesting video I watched where a guy, when Trump was a candidate for the leadership of the Republican Party, and he analyzed how Trump answered a question and how Mitt Romney answered a question. And Mitt Romney's answer was very professionalized. It was a story in a very political sense, and it had a beginning and an end. And then Trump's answer was like a word cloud. It was all over the place. It highlighted certain moods, but it didn't really follow or complete any of its threads. And I sort of loved that because it reminded me of what someone like Marshall McLuhan would have predicted that digital and electric technologies are going to do to our brain and make them more omnidirectional and more ambient, right? And we now have the idea of a word cloud that they didn't really have 60, 70 years ago. So that's lead into this question of how do we hold the tension of adapting to and pushing back against sort of the dominant linguistic expectations that the world is creating in our brains, right? Because you could look at someone like Trump and say part of his success is he speaks the way the technology sets us up to expect speech to behave today, which is different than the more linear, robust, argumentative, detailed, early modern form of languaging. But we might also say, well, that's not good, right? That's we lose a lot of stuff if we enter into this vague word cloud universe. So how do we profitably, for our sake and for the sake of language, on the one hand, adapt to the communication style that's emerging in this moment of history, and also push back at it and struggle to hold on to the things that have been achieved by previous forms of languaging?
That's a really good question. Because I mean, if this is the way the integral is coming forth into the world, let me back up a little bit. Yeah, so one of the things that Trump does is he says things in a vague way that, to get back to the deconstructionists, that make the hearer have to interpret what he's saying. And so they're constructing something in their own head. So when he says, make America great again, he doesn't refer to when America was great before, but lets everybody who's hearing him put their own spin on it. And, everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but, I've seen interviews with, a number of MAGA people, and it's like they all have their own, like, oh, America was great in this era, in that era, and like there's no common reference. He leaves reference completely fluid, and that's part of the operating of language that allows us to understand each other. Is we have some common reference points, whether It's calling, this a glass as opposed to a blarp. If I suddenly started saying, Layman, could I get a blarp of water? You'd be like, a what?
I'm sorry, I have only like half a blarp available. Is that all right?
Um, so uh so these are the kinds of issues that as we start to think about, well, how do we reformulate or restructure language in such a way as to allow us to bring in more integral consciousness into it. How fluid, how flexible is it? Can it be? Before we start falling into a kind of word salad, no man's land. Um, there's pluses and minuses to each side, and I think context plays a really big part in it, and in defining how precise language needs to be. Now, how then do you go about specifying context? A lot of times we just rely on environmental cues, but what if we had a more robust way of specifying context so that people know, oh, interpret the word salad that I'm about to say poetically versus interpret it scientifically or anthropologically, or just how precise contextually do you want to get? I mean, this is kind of the direction the next book is going to be going in, just for uh to foreshadow what's coming. Like the book we're talking about, Embracing Paradox, is just it's kind of just laying the groundwork for what I feel is actually the more important work. Like, but if you can't handle paradox, if you can't handle like holding the tension of two opposites, how the hell are you gonna hold five different contexts, simultaneously? When there might be five people around a table or 10 people around a table, all like coming from different points of view, different perspectives.
Context, it seems like it operates at different scales.
It does,
So,
yeah.
right, we have these things, we have paradigms and worldviews, which are sort of like contexts that operate or hover outside of our immediate social and physical circumstance. So I speak this way with this person, this way with this person, but still I speak within the purview of modernity or something like that. So there's these larger abstract contexts for speech acts. And then there's like maybe a deeper, more nuanced, smaller context as well, where like here I am speaking in family space, but I can also become aware that I'm actually speaking individually to my relationship with each of these people or to my relationship with different parts of each of these people. Um, I'm curious what comes up for you around like contexts that are both larger and more nuanced than the sort of immediate physical and social circumstance that we normally take as our context for speech.
I think Nora Bateson, she's got ideas about triple contexts that, whenever we're thinking about contexts, we have to go at least out to three to really get the full idea of from the immediate context to the more general to the like cultural, or paradigmatic or worldview, and make them transparent, because they're always there. We just either assume them, or they're in the unconscious. But what if we brought them up to consciousness? That would be a way to negotiate your last question, like how fuzzy or precise does it need to be? Like when you're speaking with conscious awareness of, your three levels of context, I think that'll give plenty of be a solid enough container for the language to be interpreted.
So those three are sort of the minimum that's necessary to provide the participants in language the space to feel around to figure out what's the best fit for this circumstance.
Yeah. So here's an interesting example. Let's just like bring this down to reality for people listening. Lakoff and Johnson in I think it's in their book Metaphors We Live By. Although no, it might have been in one of George Lakoff's later books, like the one about politics. The Political Mind. I think it's in The Political Mind. He talks about how conservatives and liberals both use the word family and government. Okay. However, the context and the sort of the background, like what's in the unconscious, what's in the background for each of them, is radically different. So this is his structurings. So I'm just repeating here. It's probably not this simplistic, but what I'm going to say is going to sound a little simplistic. So conservatives, he maintains, have a kind of top-down family structure where, dad's the king, mom's below him, and the kids are all sort of like, they got to toe the line. It's very hierarchical. Think of a triangle. And we map, well, okay, before I say that, so liberals, however, have a more, circular conception of family. Like, we're all equal, we're all in this together, we all help each other out. And, you're accountable to the whole, not you're accountable to dad. I mean, in this structure, it's like you're accountable to dad. To dad, to God, to, whoever sits at the top of the pyramid. And so family is the root idea for government. And so we project these ideas of what family looks like onto our government, and therefore have very different expectations of how people should behave within government, and how government should function, and who's accountable for what. And so we can have a discussion between liberals and conservatives, and be using the same words, but the ideas in the head are completely different. Only we don't know that. And so we think we're being understood by the other when we're not. And like how many other places, I mean, does things like that happen in our languaging, because we haven't made our own like unconscious structures and assumptions conscious.
Hmm.
So that's just getting at context,
Yeah.
like what if we knew enough to bring those different contexts, like my context for family and government is this, yours is that. Okay, how can we like bring together a triangle and circle?
There's, it does seem to me that the um, evolving enrichment of language needs to bring hidden contexts out, and that there's a sort of calcified surface layer, right? I remember
Yeah.
talking to a young Mormon missionary on the street who asked if I wanted to have a discussion about God. And I immediately like we have no clue whether we mean the same thing by that word or not. There's even opposite things that could be concealed. So like I wish I'm like, yes, but don't use that word. If you just describe what you mean rather than naming it, maybe we can have a discussion. So there are these hidden things. I think it's a big part of what motivates something like integral theory or other analogous sort of models, because one of the things that I really appreciated early on in reading Ken Wilber was in Integral Psychology, where he has a chapter on spirituality, and he gives five different definitions, which are the five places in his model where the word spirituality might apply. But it was really beautiful to say this word, it's not like this word can mean anything, but it certainly doesn't mean one thing we all know either. So there's some range in the middle. They go, maybe it means these five things, or maybe it means these 12 things, but that multiplicity of hidden contexts has to be brought out, and then maybe it can be restructured and rendered coherent, but at the very least, it has to be exposed if language has a chance to move forward.
Yeah. Wittgenstein did something similar with the concept of essence. People think like a word conveys the essence of what it's referring to, nouns in particular. Uh, so he took the word game and tried to find the essence of game. And um, when you look at all the different kinds of games, some highly structured, some made up in the moment with your dog, um, or kids make them up in the moment. Some have rules. Some the rules are a little, like we're making them up as we go along too. He basically came to the conclusion that there really isn't an essence. They're family resemblances. Like some games look like this. They have boards and they have things you move around the board, and other games have balls and you do things with balls, toss them and hit them, and other games have hiding. I mean, just imagine, hide and seek popping up into, your favorite basketball game. So yeah, fuzzy boundaries, family resemblances, um, context, words meaning different things in different ways. So so these are issues that we already have with our, nice organized linear language of one word after another and uh lines of text. What if this was actually, like a thought form, a paragraph? Like what if we developed a fully, how does it go? Fully nonlinear two-dimensional structure of language. And, like the central circle would mean something, these would mean something else, these would mean something else, and connections between them. I mean, this wasn't created to be that, but I think that's why the first time I saw it, I'm like, that has to go on the cover of my book. Because it could be a prototype for a new form of language. Like you could look at this and just like grok something really vast and complex. And you could sit and analyze the relation of all the parts, if you needed to write a PhD or something.
Yeah, the relation of time to that kind of language interests me because there's a certain way in which time is built into standard linear speech. You're starting, it's going to take a while to get from the beginning to the end of the sentence. And then when we look at uh, sort of higher order symbolic languages, which are, like you say, there's an ancient history of that. There's some elements of esoteric human history that have tried to do that or have purported to do that, and future possibilities of conveying a structure that doesn't track in a linear sequence, but nonetheless there is some temporal dimension there to understanding it. And that temporal dimension could be a process of analytic breakdown, like you said, if you're going to write a PhD about it. It might also be just time spent in affective contemplation of the symbol-like presence of the totality of the language. Uh,
So yeah, sort of like meditating on a
yeah,
tanka or
because even
something.
though
Yeah.
I grasp it all at once, I'm not going down the sentence sequence. Still, tomorrow I grasp it more, and the next day
Yeah,
I
yeah.
grasp it more. Yeah. Um, it's interesting. I think one of the things that Bruce and I have discussed a lot are languages for different kinds of states, which, different kinds of ontological games that we can play. And the typical way we talk about states in integral theory is borrowed from the old Hindu and theosophical model. We say gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. But it always seemed to me that there were kinds of languaging patterns that were more appropriate for each of those. So when we talk about the gross realm or the concrete realm, we're sort of talking about verbs and nouns, right? Where the ball rolled into the park. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And when we talk about the subtle, we very often mean things that would require adjectives and adverbs to describe, right? It was a mood, and the mood maybe took this form or that form, or like an angel is an entity that has angelic qualities, not necessarily a physical object. And then there's, I think this is in some ways the trickiest one. What do we mean by the causal, which is a little bit like tautological structures, structures that seem to cause themselves or that fold their own presence and absence into each other in really interesting ways. And if we say words that are apophatic, like it's unspeakable, right? We sort of you make a statement that cancels all the possible variations. And then there's this other language, and I think the causal and the non-dual often get conflated when mystics try to talk about things. Non-dual strikes me as more transdual, that instead of saying something like emptiness or unity or eternity, you're saying time and eternity and something else. You're bringing the two opposites forward. You're exceeding them, but you're not removing them. So there's like a language of paradox. There's an apophatic language. There's a qualitative language, and there's an object and motion language. And that seems to be built into the way we speak, more or less. I'm curious, when you think about multiple states of consciousness or of being in terms of the future of languaging, how do you think of different kinds of realities speaking themselves into human community?
Different kinds, meaning there's like, for example, there's four you just went through.
Yeah, for example, those four. Yeah.
Um, okay, so you wouldn't use non-dual language to order a pizza. Um, you'd still have to specify that you
Unless
want,
it's that joke where you ask the pizza guy to make you one with everything.
Yeah, right. um, so I don't really know how to answer your question. I don't know if there is an answer, and if I tried, I just, like get myself completely tied up in knots. Um, but let's, can I like nudge it
Please.
in a little different direction? So, so, uh, so you've read the book. You've seen the various types of glyphs that I've introduced as not like here's the answer, folks, but as like here's a little spark to get you, imagining. And some of them are a very uh blatant way of bringing dualities into an interdependent relationship with each other. And those look like little yin yang symbols with one word on one half and another word on another half as a way to help people remember that these types of concepts, even though we've got two separate words, actually are interdependent. Um, I should probably give an example. Let me just go straight to the index where I've got a whole list of them. The one that I like to talk about is freedom and responsibility. Because if if you want freedoms, responsibilities come with it. But a lot of times people forget and they just want freedom, 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 freedom from, freedom to, and they they forget that with freedom for oneself also comes freedom for everybody else. And that because of that, while you're exercising your freedom, you also have to think of their freedoms. And that's the responsibility part. Okay, but things like immanent and transcendent go together. Intellectual and artistic, language and culture, linguistic and ontological. So, so that's kind of like taking the first form, what was the first form the name you gave it? Like the ball rolling down the hill.
Oh, the gross realm language and
Gross realm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's like taking the gross realm and sort of gluing it to the non-dual realm in a rather crude sort of way. Um, there are other glyphs in the book that are a little more subtle, and like the entire glyph means a paragraph. Like there's a glyph that looks kind of snowflake-like, but the inside and the outside are, kind of like mirroring each other. And that means the deeper you look at something, the less it looks like itself and the more it looks like its opposite. When you get to the core, it looks like its opposite. So, like that's it's kind of a complex concept as well as a method, a way of looking at something to look very deeply into it, to see that, when you look deeply, you get you come out the other side of the wormhole, so to speak. And that's a different way of trying to bring language to a non-dual kind of consciousness. So these are just like two different ways that I've thought of, and I'm sure that there are lots of creative people in the world um who you know would think of entirely different ways, and I think it'll be interesting to see, to bring people together to say, like, hey, let's just play in the sandbox for a while. Like we have to start developmentally the way we start, developmentally with everything, and start just by playing.
Yeah, this is the what we need is a widely distributed kindergarten for
Yeah.
trans-dual languaging. Because I do think, when I look at, and maybe lots of us who are watching this and listening to this have had this experience of, in their educational process, coming across interesting things in physics or logic or mysticism and going, oh, right, one of those, right? The Escher Möbius Klein shapes. And they go beyond our normal philosophical and conventional social discussions. And then if it turns out that those aren't like the end points of human knowledge, but the opening to a new realm in which those structures are the alphabet of a more expansive way of being and thinking, then we need a lot of people playing around and trying to figure out what the letters of those alphabets are and just getting comfortable playing with them and looking for locally practical ways of exchanging those symbols.
Yeah, yeah. And I fully understand that you're using alphabet here very metaphorically, not like recreating a different type of alphabet, but just as like primitives. Like
Yeah,
these are
exactly.
these are
Yeah.
our basic building blocks.
Yes, not a
Yeah.
not a finite linear sequenced alphabets.
Right, right.
But and in some ways that's what, in dealing with integral theory and in dealing with other people, contemporary and historical, who've built meta models of like trying to build coherent set of multiple dimensions and perspectives. One of the interesting things is we tend to get trapped in those models once we've built them and in the terminology that describes them. But I
Mm.
think we've seen enough people now, even though it's only still a few, build these models that what we have to do is extract the pieces and recombine them and play with them and communicate them in various ways and not worry so much about the package of those pieces, but just have an open flowing discourse of the vision logic structures in general.
Yeah, yeah. Um, because in doing that, I mean that's like the creative process right there is, taking things, breaking them down, putting them back together in new ways, um, and doing that at all, you know, at all levels. The, the syntactic level, the semantic level, the level of concept, the level of logic. Once we start getting into playing with non-dual types of languages, we're going to also have to think about how logic needs to be revised
Mm.
and how our category structures, which we don't think about. We learn them when we're little, and then, they get sort of baked in. Um, how to retrain ourselves and then train the next generations, to think differently about category structures so that, we don't necessarily separate spirit from matter, quite so forcefully. What kinds of different category structures could we have? And then those category structures then become our culture. So ultimately, as we're thinking about ways to revise, restructure language, um, to better express non-duality, we're also going to have to be like revising our culture to give us the space to do that. Because it's our culture that is you know, sort of the larger vessel within which language functions.
There's a philosophical element of what I'm feeling right now, but maybe I'll come back to it because I'm also thinking about the role that humor plays in
Mm.
introducing paradox into social discourse. And I don't know if you know Stephen Wright, who's a stand-up comedian for many
Oh, I
years. I went
love
to see him a
Stephen
few times.
Wright.
And one of my favorite things he did was this, my friend said I was wearing two different socks. I said they're the same to me because I go by thickness. Right. Just like that little piece, you go, oh, right. We might be able to change the categories we're using here. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
there's probably a
My
big role
favorite.
for humor to make this stuff emotionally acceptable to people.
Yeah. Well, okay, so my favorite Stephen Wright line was the other day, I lost a buttonhole.
Yeah, that it takes you right to that, apophatic mystical communication place. Probably my favorite overall was uh, I'm gonna get a tattoo over my whole body of me, but taller. Um, so you're mentioning logic, and I thought of, philosophers and theorists generally are sort of interested in what the boundaries of what they can think are, right? And as much as Descartes is thought of as the icon of rational left brain dualistic separative control of the universe, he said a very interesting thing in his little spiel on I think therefore I am, which is he says you can from a distance when you're outside of it, of course you could doubt it. You go, yeah, I don't need that. I can be without that. I'm not bound by that structure. He said, but when you think your way through it, you find you don't have any options. And there's an interesting thing there about how logic is formed. But I think that same kind of attitude applies to richer and more complex logics. So one of the things Bruce and I and a few other people do a lot is take advantage of the slash mark. So you'd say like dis slash order. And when I try to think it through, it turns out I don't think I can think order or disorder on their own. Like if I think, did the world come from order or disorder? If it came from disorder, that disorder would have to be homogeneous enough and distinct enough from order in order to be just disorder and no order, right? So I'm like, so that's already a minimal amount of order, though. So it's not possible for me to think pure disorder or pure order. They're always in some kind of relation to each other. And so then I'm doing kind of what Descartes was talking about. I'm running up against the limits of what it's possible for me to think, but in a way that sort of transcends the ethos of modernity that he seemed to embody. But it feels to me like when we make this move of going from the play with these primitives to how do we instantiate them as logic, a lot of that will have to do with kind of codifying the limits of our ability to think things.
Codifying the limits of our ability to think things.
Right? Like when I think through dis slash order, right? For me,
Yeah.
that dis slash order codifies the fact that when I really check, I can't think them apart from each other, right? That they're
Right.
combined
Okay.
in a primitive.
Right. Okay. So your slash is kind of working the same way as my little yin yang things in the
Yeah.
margins. Yeah. 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 Right. Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly the point is when there's one, there's always the other one lurking. And the way our concepts are structured now in separating order and disorder, and we give them different definitions. We think they're different. We think they're separate. But they're distinct but not separate. And I invented a little glyph for that too, to mean distinct but not separate. Because there are a lot of things when you actually like stop and think about how things are related, you get that there's a lot of stuff in our environment, in our experience, that we experience as distinct, but they're not separate. There's a relationality that's built in, and our language tries to take care of that sort of thing with verbs right now, or with predicates or things that do the linking, but that still enables the two different things to be kept like linguistically separate, when ontologically they're not. So yeah, that's a big thing to try to play with in our sandbox.
One of the ways, so it's different kinds of statements, different kinds of punctuation, different kinds of glyphs. There's a number of different ways to start playing in this sandbox. One that's coming up for me is uh, isolating pieces of the received cultural knowledge. Um, how would I say this? Oh, this is going to sound like a tangent, but it folds back in. One of the things I always loved about Kierkegaard when I started reading him was he made this argument for faith, and he said faith is the opposite of knowledge, the opposite of what's reasonable. And so the most unreasonable thing can give you the greatest faith, and the most unreasonable thing is that the infinite was present as a finite being in history, and that the divine and the finite can be the same thing. And therefore, I worship Jesus because he's the most ridiculous, impossible, irrational, absurd thing there is. Right. And from a trans Christian context, it's like saying, I'm I'm devotionally in relationship to the divine human because of its paradoxical structure. And yet he's taking a chunk of the received ethos of Western culture and going, you see, this bit has non-dual structure to it. It's like also if you took just the Sistine Chapel with those two fingers almost touching, you could be like, oh, that's suggestive of something. So I think one other way to play in the sandbox is to make memes that kind of have the glyph structure, but are fragmentary pieces of the culture we receive.
Yeah, because the fragments, if they're engaging enough, okay, and Jesus was apparently engaging enough that we're still talking about him 2000 years later. There's a kind of embodiment. There's a word in poetry for this, metonymy or something like that, where uh so Jesus as Christ, not like just as the person walking around, but Jesus as the Christ, knew that he was one that was both, which is the title of my first book. In other words, he knew and embodied the paradoxical structure of being both human and divine, and served, and what he called people to do is to be like him, not believe in him, not follow him, like just to see where he's going to go, but to become that as well. And so I think if we have ways of sparking that kind of knowing in people themselves, for them to be able to embody their own non-duality. In Jungian psychology, you would call some of that, embracing your shadow. knowing that you're both, loving and kind and generous and, petty and mean and nasty. And yeah, okay. Sometimes I have to be petty, mean, and nasty in order to correct, something else. It's when you get that you are both, then you have within yourself the power to call up whatever you need in the situation. If you only think of yourself as loving and kind and good, then when you need to be mean and nasty, you don't have that capacity because you've denied it in yourself. So where am I going with all of this? Right, finding ways for people to not just see the paradox in language, but in life and in themselves, and be inspired to embody it.
So I love this, and to me, it almost seems like the language speaking itself through us has this sort of natural progression. So you go to the really structural, transcendental, historical place, and then the next move is embodiment and affect in various ways. So uh, it seems like the future of languaging also involves people having a very diverse training, whatever that training means, might be mostly circumstantial, in being able to speak from these different parts, right? That to being able to, you don't necessarily want to lose your petty, nasty part. You need to be able to be conciliatory and aggressive, and you need to have like dialects of yourself that are capable of each of these. A way I often think about it is sort of the problem of superlatives is of great interest to me in terms of, on the one hand, superlative claims are almost always factually false, but on the other hand, you need them to get into certain states.
That's like so true, dude.
Exactly. Or if I want to be in my aspirational mystical state, I have to be related to the most true and the most high and the most glorious and the all knowing. But then also, if I want to move some energy in an intimate relationship, I might have to exaggerate the degree to which the issue is pertinent, right? You always, and of course you don't always, but I need to say that or I won't be able to process this. So that seems like an additional complementary piece of this is setting up the social conditions to educate our ability to have these full spectrum of discourses with each other.
Bingo. Yeah, I like that full spectrum of discourses. Um, saying what needs to be said, saying what's unsaid, uh, and saying what can't be said. And I'm only being like half facetious there because there's a paradox, of course, on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are a lot of social rules that tell you what can't be said. And a lot of those rules, they're not explicit, they're very implicit within our society. Um, and some societies have maybe even stricter rules than American society. We let it hang out quite a bit.
One thing that interests me about that is how sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's non-obvious what the linguistic inhibitions mean, right? So, sort of famously, Foucault, in his last book, in the introduction, says, we think of Victorian society as very repressed in terms of what they could say about sexuality. But if you look at what happened in that culture at that time period, there was an explosion of discourse around sexuality that took the form of finding other ways to say it, so that the inhibition actually functioned as a generator, not an
Yeah.
inhibitor.
Yeah. Yeah, and look at like what a lot of the commentators say about Trump and his circle is, oh my God, they actually said the quiet part out loud, which is really interesting that these kinds of social inhibitions are being they're being brought out of the shadows and into the light right now. Because them saying the quiet part aloud allows all of us to see the um the values that are this is getting into our email now, the values that are hiding under the words.
Do
um
you do you know how Dianetics auditing happens? Is like the foyer into Scientology.
uh
Okay, they do this
a
for anybody
little
who's listening.
bit.
They do a
I
very
think
interesting thing.
somebody explained it to me a while ago, but I can't say I remember it all.
So you get a device that's kind of like a lie detector. It registers when your body has an electrical surge. So the needle flickers or it sort of stays in place. And they hook
Okay.
you up to this and they try to get you to say, in a way, the quiet part out loud, right? You're going back over problematic or unconscious or conflicted periods of your past. And then when they see the needle jump, they see your body react, they make you say those statements over and over and over again until the needle doesn't fluctuate. And then you've cleared that part,
Hmm.
right? And so that can be conceived in a positive way, which is you've discharged a blockage or you've transferred that energy from free floating jouissance into your rational linguistic part, or it could be perceived negatively, like you've numbed yourself out to the meaning
Yeah.
of your own experiences. But I'm curious what you think about a process like that, about the repetitive use of language to um, free us from the sense of the charge and the overwhelm of our experience.
Okay, so Jung, I don't know if he pioneered it. I think they were doing sort of galvanic response type experiments in his day anyway. Um, but with he was doing, kind of word association um tests while you're hooked up to a that kind of machine. And and this is how he hit on the concept of a complex. So when a word was said and either like you took a long time to respond, um, that that signaled that there was a charge in some way, maybe not, like a literal charge like in your example, but a psychic charge around that word. And then if you dug in, psychologically into, well, why did you have such a hard time associating with mother, the word mother, then you could get into that was like his way of figuring out the concept of a complex, what he calls a complex, which is that sort of psychic charge associated. um well, I'm not explaining it very well. There's a lot more to it than that. But for our purposes today, we'll leave it at that. Um So on the one hand, yeah, that kind of physiological response can show us what's buried in our psychological, underground vaults. Um, and once you bring up what is in, your personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, um, and start working with it to heal. I mean, things get charged like that because there's some sort of pain that we don't want to feel. And so one, allowing yourself to feel the pain is one way to reduce the charge. But another way that we feel the pain without feeling it is we tell it as a story over and over and over again. I mean, I remember, in my younger years, like whenever I'd meet somebody new, they'd get the story, about whatever it was, how my childhood was messed up, mainly. And I did some transformative work to get that that's just a story. I mean, yeah, what happened. I made up this story about it that I keep telling and repeating as if it's so much a part of my identity that story defines me. But once you get that it's just a story, then some of the charge goes away and some of the pain goes away. And I think that's the point of it's I don't know if it's numbing yourself out or just allowing the charge that is buried in that story to kind of dissipate, as a way of healing. I think
Yeah, there's a number of different metaphors we can guess might be applicable in that transition, but one of the ones that I like the most is just this fantasy of being able to migrate some of that charge to the leading edge of language rather than to like a buried component of language, because it seems like our ability both to participate in the unfolding of language generally and to learn these different discourse skills we were talking about, it requires like our body and our heart has to let us do that. And if it's holding back energy and won't let us speak certain things, and maybe the symptom of not speaking it is that we say nothing, but maybe the symptom of not speaking it is we always tell the same story, which always stops short of actually saying the thing with the charge in it. That inhibits our ability to be spiritual organisms participating with language, because we won't let that charge actually flow across into language. And so we
yeah.
inhibit ourselves, but we inhibit language's energy to move forward.
Yeah, and sometimes those things that we don't speak actually start showing up as like physical problems in the body. Um, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that because if I go where I'm gonna go, then uh, you know, I,
Hmm.
I could get myself into trouble
Okay.
on YouTube. So
Enticing.
I won't go there.
Uh, okay, I've been asking all the questions. What do you want to talk about?
So I'm curious, since you're like one of the few people who's read the book so far, what do you think is the most important thing for future readers to to get from the book?
I think the most important thing is the invitation, right? And it's throughout the book, but it's also possible that it could be more overt, which is to say, hey, this is a call to you to play in this playground, right? That everything else you hear here is like opening up a horizon and giving us tools and giving us examples for how we need a lot more people like you, the reader, to start experimenting with this. I think that's the key message there. Because the rest of the stuff, the theory stuff, and you're working on a second book, there is a sense, even though there's a lot of great ideas in there, that you're setting a stage for a next theory work. So it's not like the theory is necessarily the most important thing. I think the most important thing is the invitation and the not quite political, but the anthemic, the inspiring mood of that invitation.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's an invitation, and I'm, you know, in 2025, I'm going to start building a place online for people to, come together to start discussing these things. Because it's it's not just a question of language. It is also a question of anthropology and of art. Meaning like how do we actually like design something new? And it's a question of philosophy and ethics and logic. And it's a question of music and how do we bring in the actual like sounding of new forms of language, um because sound is generative of form. And so do we want to like bring some sort of sacred sounding and sacred geometry into creating a language that is trying to bring non-duality or bring, spirit and matter, mind and body, however you want to, whatever words you want to put to it, to um, re-enchant them. So yeah, lots of different people with lots of different skills, and open open minds, because this is just, at this stage, just playing in the sandbox. There's the beginnings of, how do I say this? We didn't always have architects to build buildings. People would just, think of something in their head, maybe lay out some lines and start putting up walls or mud or grasses or whatever. And it's only recently that the whole field of architecture came into being. And so right now, I think with regard to creating new languages, we're still in the sandbox level playing with things, but there are people who are taking it and developing it as a field. The conlangers, the people who like to construct languages, and uh, so there's momentum already towards developing a more I don't want to say serious because it should all be fun. I mean, this should be fun, right? um a more organized approach. Play can just, it can be sort of unorganized, and that's good. for the reasons we discussed earlier. But eventually we will need to organize ourselves. But for now, let's just play.
Yeah, when I think about the transition from um, the small scale improvisational construction of human dwellings to the realm of historical architecture, we used to think about that as something that was created out of the necessity of the agricultural revolution, but we've since found much older sites that look like there were large scale religious installations of various kinds that came a long time before the necessity. So there might come a point where some people have to persuade others that there's a sacred task
Yeah.
and holy necessity to taking this to its next stage. When I think of con languages, something that popped up for me is that our sense of the subtle affective resonances of certain kinds of statements, which go into a lot of novel language experiments, particularly the ones we see in fiction, Game of Thrones and Star Trek, and famously Tolkien's world, where there's the beautiful language of the elves and then the horrible language of the orcs and lots of Mordor, right? M's and R's and G's are evil. And that in some ways, the play and the intelligence and the consciousness is very admirable. But is there also a risk that our biases and our regressive tendencies are instantiated in the way we do that, right? Because you can kind of complain that Tolkien is reinforcing xenophobia and racism and like this sense that some language and some people are the beautiful light ones and some are these horrible little ones, and you can tell because of the feeling you get from the sounds they're using. So there's like what's developmental and what's regressive in the way we approach the aesthetics of the creation of new languages, because they might instantiate our existing subconscious biases.
Yeah, and that's exactly why in that chapter where I'm talking about conlanging, I'm saying over and over, question your assumptions. Question your assumptions about language. And you brought up a really good assumption in that, the way language sounds might elicit certain feelings, whether we're aware of that or not. Yeah, and let's try not to get regressive about it and see what other sorts of assumptions we might be able to come up with. Yeah, because pretty much whatever we build is built on top of assumptions, whether it's language or buildings or governments or education systems. So knowing what they are, I think, is the first step. Knowing what our own assumptions are, and then working with the polarities around those assumptions. Like if if you assume that fricatives and gutturals indicate evil, like work with that, play with it. How could fricatives and gutturals like actually convey something good? Like the chirping of a bird, or I don't know. I'm just saying, question your assumptions and play with them. Play with the
The
assumptions, play with
the
the
role of question here seems essential. I had
yeah.
a flash to one of my favorite altered state experiences many years ago came as a result of doing this practice where I was surfacing any sort of subliminal discomforts and converting it into a question. Like every discomfort was an uncertainty, and every uncertainty was was like a question I hadn't articulated yet. And by articulating it, it sort of lost some of its distressing power over my psyche. And then I began to think about that as being not too different in a way than how science begins with questions and tries to investigate the limiting assumptions we have about the material world. And I'm curious what you would say in response to something like, what does the shape of questioning itself tell us about the relationship between language and the lived world?
The shape of questioning itself. Okay, so for me, when I go into like, what is the shape of questioning itself? It's it's like a constant opening. And what that brings to mind is like a lotus, like that just keeps opening with more petals and more petals and more petals. And so to relate that to our to life itself is like the more you question, the more life will open and reveal to you. The less will be hidden. And so if you keep questioning, the the greater and richer uh life could be.
What came up for me there was, first of all, this appreciation of question as the open-ended process, right? As an example of the process of life moving forward. And then I immediately compared it to sort of the period at the end of a sentence, right? And these conclusive statements that seem terminating. But then I thought, well, I'm being a little too judgy about that because I could make an ironic or a playful definitive statement, and then the irony or the play or the quotation marks around it actually serve the same function as the opening at the end of a question. And then I thought, well, that's a really interesting thing to me. I've been in discussions with other spiritual teachers who don't like me putting the absolute in quotes. And what I want to say to them is like, I put everything in quotes, right? Right? Quote, to be in quotes is to be real. So I'm saying the absolute is real because it's in quotes. Otherwise, it would be unreal. Uh, but yeah,
That's very mobile of you.
no, thank you, thank you. uh, That's our allotted 90 minutes. How do you feel? Do you want to keep talking? Do you feel like we're done? Where are we here?
um hmm. Well, I'm always one to keep talking. It's, if you want to keep talking, I'll keep talking. If you don't,
Well, let,
if you
let's let's go a
if you've
little bit
got,
further and see what happens.
okay.
And I kind of want to throw it back to you again. If you were the host, what would you ask right now?
Oh, well, if I were the host, so, Lisa, where can we find you on the internet? Ah, I'll answer my own question. One sec. It's lisamaroski.com. LISAMAROSKI.com. And if I were to ask a more uh metaphysical question, it would be uh what kind of world do you want to live into? Maybe that's what we can take up next, because that's
Sure.
that's a big
Uh,
opening.
It is a big opening. My first flash, and it'll be my junction point for next time, is because I just mentioned Tolkien now, so he's on my mind. And I don't know if we talked about this last time or not. There's a sense in which the fictional worlds we would love to live in are almost always worlds where you don't see any signage, right? Where you don't see language in public spaces. And there's like a message. When you see words, it's like, oh, that word is for somebody who doesn't know where things are. And you're being addressed as if you were someone who isn't local to the circumstance. So when there's no signage, you feel like, oh, I have to be local here somewhere. So there's a, like, what does the gesture of language itself say? But in the world I would like to live in doesn't have written messages addressing me as a general member of the public everywhere I go. So that's where I will try to pick it up next time, and hopefully we can have Bruce come and join us for a third discussion, as well as have you come back when the next book is ready.
That's several years down the line, but yeah, okay.
Okay, we'll check in every 6 months. Are you ready? Is it done?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'd love to have Bruce join us.
Okay. Well, this is great. This is one of my favorite things. I'm glad you're thinking into it, and I was very happy with the places we were able to find ourselves as interlocutors.
Likewise. Oh, I'd like Jedediah, the non-dual mule, to join us too.
We'll see if we can get him. He's been having some health difficulties, but I
Oh,
think he's essential.
okay.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. See you.
Bye-bye.